We now need to start talking about the transition from property to contract. We made a whole series of videos and posts about the concept of property with Hegel, and we made one video about the concept of contract. But what about the transition from property to contract? Now, to begin with, that transition is not of an external nature. By that I mean that the concept of contract, does not add anything new to the concept of property. Rather, the concept of property already contains the concept of contract. Property actually evokes something like contract as well. Of course, you cannot say that of the positive law, the purely legalistic concept of contract. You cannot say it of the historical development of property and contract either, but you have to say it from a philosophical point of view. There is an understandable relationship between property and contract. They are not simply juxtaposed, as in the legal system, as two different forms of law. More importantly, in modern times, the concept of contract has become very essential to the understanding of the modern state. The contract is a central category in modern thinking about law and state. The point is that Hegel wants to clarify the meaning of the concept of contract from the leading viewpoint of the whole philosophy of law, and that is the idea of the realization of freedom. Now, we must note that when we speak of the realization of freedom in the case of property and contract, we are, of course, at the same time dealing with the limits of this realization of freedom. Let's go back to the concept of property. There it is about the relationship between the will and a thing. The contract now expresses that this relation between the will and a thing actually has another assumption. That assumption is that there is also a relationship between different freedoms. When I am an owner in accordance with law, it means that I am also recognized as such by others. Freedom comes to exist, to an external reality, in an external thing. But that is real only if it is also recognized by others. There must be a common will that is the basis for my will becoming concrete in property. The contract as an exchange of things on which different freedoms agree is actually the foundation, the bringing into being of such a common will. So the contract expresses that common will, and that common will then actually turns out to be the assumption of the concept of property. Without recognition, no property. So that relation of one freedom to another is already implied in the relation between the will and the thing. The thing in which I put my will is something external. It is external. It has no being for itself, but it only has being for something else. The being of the thing is essentially also a relation to other external things, hence being for something else. But being for another is more than an external thing, because in being for another is expressed that I am an individual free person who puts his will into a thing. So the relationship to other freedoms belongs structurally to ownership, and that is made explicit in the contract. Property is thus the involvement of my will not just on an external thing that has no will of its own, but property implies the involvement of my will on that of others. My freedom is involved in other freedoms. Thus, the contract is at the same time a new form of law. And just by the way, as a reminder that in the concept of law, we are dealing with the concrete conditions of the realization of freedom. Freedom thus comes to a specific existence in the contract. It is not only embodied in an external thing, but it is also expressed in a common will. A common will of the recognition of owners against each other. In the contract, I acquire property by disposing of property also. I externalize the property is the technical term Hegel uses for it. Through contract with other owners, I also come to acquire new property. So I am an owner of a thing because we want it. I have acquired the property by disposing of another property. Namely, I have bought something, and I have acquired new property as a result. The contract is in fact a process in which we first have a contradiction. I own this thing, and you own this other thing, but the contract is a process in which that contradiction is mediated. That is, the opposites become involved in each other, and their common foundation is exposed. I am an independent owner of something because I exclude the will, the freedom of others. But that is because, in the contract at least, I identify myself with that will of others, recognize it, and thereby, in the exchange and in the sale, I cease to be an owner of this particular thing. So the contract is a better realization of the idea of freedom. Freedom now no longer exists only in that external thing of which I am the owner, but freedom exists in the free common will, the collective will. The we will, you might say, because we want it. So the objective form of the will that we get here is no longer a foreign and external thing, but a different will, namely the common will that operates in the making of agreements. Moreover, the will is less abstract or separate than in the case of property, for this will is rooted in a common will. The self has thereby become a self through the recognition of others. The result of this exchange or mediation of the extreme leads to selfhood. Self-being is the result of this, and that is actually now the interest the mind has in it. The subjective will is raised to a higher level of generality in the contract. It is no longer the individual will versus the thing, but the individual will versus another individual will with whom it corresponds. So this is not an economic category, because the fact that parties make contracts because they have a need for it, or because they have private pursued interests, and therefore establish a common will, that does not matter further. Something fundamental is at work, and that is that interest of reason. Indeed, a contract is the realization of something general. In the contract, the partners recognize each other as owners, as free persons existing for themselves. Psychological and economic processes are in fact possible only on the basis of a much more fundamental dynamic, and that is the dynamic of the realization of freedom. It is not so much a question of my wanting to recognize someone as a legal person by entering into a contract with him. It is not at all about my intentions and intentions. What matters is that the reality of the contract is actually a recognition of the personhood of another.
Yet even the contract is only a limited mode of existence of freedom. It is not yet the idea of freedom, that is, it is not yet the moment when understanding and existence coincide, and so this will be evident from the further analysis of the contract, or agreement, in which we will find that the contract does not give a complete explanation of political reality, and we will also find that there remains an element of arbitrariness to the contract. Namely, contracts are also contested and violated. About that in one of our next contributions.